folks, Jeff Salzman here. Welcome to the Daily Evolver and to a new episode of Post-Progressive Inquiries, where my co-host Steve McIntosh and I talk with people who are co-creating the next stage of human development. Steve McIntosh is, of course, the founder of the Institute for Cultural Evolution with its Post-Progressive project, and author of many books on integral theory, including his latest, Developmental Politics. Our guest today is David Storey, a professor of philosophy from Boston College. David discovered integral thinking outside of academia, as did most of us, but is now bringing its principles to bear on his teaching. Whether the subject is history, religion, or the emerging ethics of environmentalism, David's focus is on helping his students to learn how to communicate and navigate across worldviews, which is very important and very integral. David also hosts the podcast Wisdom at Work, where he talks with philosophers who have gone beyond the ivory tower to build careers outside of academia. David, Steve, and I cover a lot of territory in this conversation. In the first part, we consider how academia itself is evolving, particularly in its ever so slight warming to developmental theory. In the second half of our conversation, we discuss how to bring more cultural intelligence to humanity's climate challenge and highlight David's new essay in the Post-Progressive Post, Why We Will Grow Together or Grow Apart. I hope you enjoy this episode of the Post-Progressive Post with me, Steve McIntosh, and David Storey. Thanks for listening. Well, I guess I'd start by asking you, David, unlike me, your father obviously did not forbid you from going into philosophy. And so you are a young philosopher in academia. And that's just really interesting to me. And I think it is to a lot of our listeners. And so I'm curious as to how you found your way there, and then also how you found your way into integral. And I also want to know how integral is landing in academia. And so that's sort of the category of my questions.
Great. So my dad not only did not forbid me to major in philosophy, he encouraged it. In fact, I have a vivid memory. I think it was sophomore year. I was driving back spring semester with my roommate to college, and we were pulling out of the driveway. I grew up in New Jersey, and it was around that time that it was probably becoming clear that I had been bitten by the philosophy bug. I had taken a course my freshman year here at BC, Boston College, actually, where I teach, called Perspectives on Western Culture. And we read Plato and Aristotle and big chunks of the Bible and Augustine and Aquinas and Machiavelli and Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau and Marx and, just a big,
name a few.
The list goes on. A big burly, grand tour of the Western tradition. And I had a very great teacher, a very intense Jesuit. And he was serious. And he treated what we thought seriously. And I felt really challenged and summoned to challenge myself. And I started psychology major. I was interested in how people think. I thought maybe I wanted to be a shrink. Pre-med. The pre-med didn't last long. And the psychology didn't last long because I found that there was more that was psychologically rich in my philosophy courses than in my psychology courses. So I pretty quickly started to gravitate toward a major in philosophy. But as I was pulling out of the driveway that day, my dad, I remember him waving and saying, "Become a philosopher."
Oh my God. Good for you.
Literally what he said.
Wow. That's great.
And
you did.
And I'm still at it. So that was a little bit of how I got into philosophy. I just took course after course, and I was just hungry, and yada yada yada. I was applying to graduate school, but about halfway through college, so this would have been summer of my junior year, summer after my junior year. I was working at a bookstore in downtown Boston called Brentano's when that was still a chain. And, I used every moment that I had to read. I'm not a customer service, retail guy. And, I got in trouble at work all the time for reading, but I kept passing as I was stocking books. I kept passing in the New Age section. I'm sure this is a common story. These books by this guy named Ken Wilber. And something just drew me to them. And I would, peek at them, while I had a break or while I should have been doing other things. And I was just like, I just want to go into this. And I dove into the deep end with sex, ecology, spirituality. There was something about it that I was just, this needs to be reckoned with. And my reaction 30 pages into that book was like the reaction that one of my Zen teachers, Robert Kennedy, who's both a Jesuit and a Zen Roshi, had when he was first sent by the Jesuits to teach in Japan, and he went to a lecture by Maezumi Roshi, who became his teacher later. And his reaction upon coming out of that was, I don't know what this is, but this is it. That was the feeling that I had with Ken's work. And I've been looking for a better story since, a better philosophical account. And I haven't really found one. So I've kind of, been with it ever since. So that was my intro to integral, and, just read everything after that, and so on. But in terms of your question, how is integral being received in academia? Well, I think things have changed over the last 20 years. Not a great deal, but a little bit of disturbance in the force. And to give you a sense for how they've changed as a marker, when I had my, integral, I don't want to use the word conversion, but, when I started getting interested in that and becoming convinced that it had a lot to offer, I approached one of my philosophy professors and I asked him if I could do a presentation in my final paper for the seminar on it. And he's very open-minded, very broad-minded, pluralistic thinker. And he let me do it. And it was good. And he said, I might learn something. He had read Grace and Grit and found it quite moving. But he said, now listen, when you apply to graduate school, it's great to have an intellectual passion and everything, but keep the Wilbur stuff out of it. And I actually thought that was the right advice at the time for me personally. And so I decided to work on Heidegger and Nietzsche. I was interested in environmental philosophy and nihilism. We could get into how those two might be related later if it works. But during my research, I encountered the work of Michael Zimmerman, who is a former fellow with the Institute for Cultural Evolution, and was involved with the Integral Institute. And he had made this shift from Heidegger to integral mid-career after he had sort of tenure and credibility in the community. And I reached out to Michael and I told him my proposal, and I didn't know him from Adam. And he emailed me back within an hour and said, your proposal sounds great. I would love to be on your dissertation committee. Oh. And so he was a sort of link for me between the academic world and integral. And so I kind of realized after a while that I was playing this long game of establishing myself in the conventional terms in the academy, while also keeping an eye on and continuing to learn integral philosophy. But the reason that I say that it's shifted is, one, there's actually been a volume co-edited by Sean Esbjørn Hargens and Michael Schwartz, an academic philosopher. It's an anthology of essays on integral philosophy, sort of in dialogue with continental philosophy, which for your listeners, sort of continental philosophy versus analytic philosophy is sort of like the Republicans and Democrats within academic philosophy in terms of different styles or approaches or traditions. So there are people who are, working on integral or interfacing, more mainstream academic philosophers with integral work. So it's starting to happen. The other thing I would say too is that postmodernism is deader than dead. And I think people are looking for a better framework to make sense of our reality. And so you might say the exhaustion of green postmodernism in a lot of intellectual quarters and academic philosophical quarters is creating some space for, I think, some more openness and receptivity to integral-ish stuff. So there's plenty more to say, but that maybe gives you a general sense for, yeah.
I'd be curious, David, as to why you were warned off of integral. What is the rub with, Wilber, integral, and academia?
Yeah. Well, two things come to mind. The first, I think that my former professor, who is now somewhat bizarrely my colleague, he still teaches here. And as a side note, I bumped into him last year and he said, "David, listen, I remember that conversation we had 20 years ago where I warned you off of Wilber."
Wow.
And I was wrong.
Oh, for heaven's sakes.
And he said, I was reading this Christian, contemplative Christian writer, Cynthia Bourgeault, who's adapted Keating's contemplative prayer or centering prayer, who draws on integral stuff, as well as Richard Rohr. And he said, I was reading this and they were drawing on Wilber and it makes so much sense. And I'm like, I know. I tried to tell you 20 years ago.
Yeah.
But I think I don't think he was wrong. I think it was the right advice. And I think he was warning me against that for the sake of my future career, in the sense that if you're not writing about, what the conversation is, what scholars are talking about, which is a, relatively limited range of scholars, or traditional philosophers recognized in the canon, as well as sort of what are the hot topics. It's one of the problems with academic discourse, we could get into this later if it's relevant, is that, the terms of what's worth talking about are set by a relatively few number of people. And so that artificially limits the conversation and what aspiring philosophers are incentivized to direct their attention and research toward. So in terms of me establishing a career in academia, it was the right advice because nobody was talking about Ken Wilber. And I think he still had the, and in some cases for some people still does have sort of the connotation of, pop philosophy or new age philosophy, or spiritual woo-woo, is. So one way I would say is that in terms of beyond why that was good advice for me, but why he had to give that advice because of the overall structure of the discipline, is two things. I mentioned continental philosophy and analytic philosophy before. I think that those pretty closely track postmodern green and modern orange in terms of worldview orientations. And so the developmental feature of integral, is obviously repellent to green, even though, many seminal thinkers like Hegel, it's an intensely developmental, ontology that Hegel has. And the second is for the modernists, the more analytic philosophers, is the, recognition of interiorities in integral philosophy that, is a problem for them, as well as any kind of spiritual worldview in general. So those are two, I think, forces within academia and academic philosophy that, are resistant, even to some extent, to integral stuff.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, let me follow up on that then and ask about, we're using this term integral, kind of throwing it around a little bit. In my 2007 book, Integral Consciousness, I have a 45-page chapter where I detail how integral philosophy is not simply Wilberian philosophy, and how we have this, starting really with Hegel and the idealists, and taking lots of different turns along the way, this basic canon of developmental philosophy, right, which includes other geniuses like Pierre Teilhard de Chardin and Alfred North Whitehead. And the part of it, we might say the allergy to non-professional philosophy or non-academic philosophy like Wilber has written, and Teilhard and many of the founders of what we now identify as integral philosophy have this spiritual orientation. In other words, I would define it as a philosophy that tries to come to grips with the reality that the universe is evolving, right? That since the Big Bang, everything's been evolving. How to make philosophical sense of that. And it's impossible to do without some notion of interiority, without some recognition of the reality of values, although you don't have to go to value objectivity, but the sort of analytical idea that values are merely subjective, that the evolutionary narrative refutes that rather roundly. So I guess what I'm saying is, if we were to label this branch of philosophy as developmental, and maybe use the term integral interchangeably, and you feel that green postmodernism, I mean, in some ways I'm happy to hear that you say that it's dead, and yet it seems like critical theory has taken over all the major universities in America as a kind of new religion. And so maybe Boston College, being based, in the sort of traditional Catholic background, is more resistant to that, but maybe not. So this idea that developmental is some understanding of a developmental philosophy is kind of where professional philosophy could go if it got it right. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about that as a, I mean, it seems like the barrier to it, they're each one. So continental philosophy might object to the whole developmental idea. The whole notion of cultural evolution is somewhat anathema to many critical discourses. Or is it more on the spiritual side, recognizing the reality of interiors and the spirituality that goes with that, I imagine is more objected to on the analytical side? Do you think transcending both of those potential roadblocks is a potential for the future?
Yeah. Wow. So my short answer is yes. So there's a lot that I thought of while you were speaking. One thing I'll preface this by is how is my own institutional situation shaping my view of these things? And one thing you mentioned in particular is really important. I teach at a Catholic Jesuit university, and so yeah, I mean, in integral terms, sort of the traditionalism has more of a home at my school, and Catholic institutions in general. So I think that is a sort of built-in buffer against Mean Green hijacking classrooms or campus life in general. So that's really important. The second thing is, you mentioned, and one of the things I loved about that book that I read when I was still in graduate school, your 2007 book, is that it situates integral as part of a broader tradition that precedes Ken, which I think he himself would recognize. And I think that, if he's right, then this is, an independent animal that is emerging increasingly. And so I think a less Wilber-centric framing of integral might be one way to, disseminate it more among the academic philosophical community. And one thing I'll say, is you're absolutely right. Whether we're talking about Hegel and the German idealists, or Whitehead, or Bergson, or Teilhard, there's a line, there is a tradition there that you can absolutely trace. And one of the unfortunate things is, Whitehead, for instance, it famously advanced process philosophy. It's just one of those things that has been sort of a minority report in 20th century philosophy as it has presently been understood. Charles Sanders Peirce, who Wilber has drawn crucial ideas from, is another one of those minority reports in the history of Western philosophy. So I think
David, what do you mean by minority report?
Oh, I mean, the sort of there's an establishment story, which would be the majority report, which would, for continental philosophy, it would be Heidegger and Foucault and Derrida, as major 20th century philosophers. And then for the analytic tradition, it would be Ludwig Wittgenstein and Bertrand Russell and Quine and, a series of thinkers. And then there's sort of the lesser deities, as it were, who some people work on, but who, you're kind of taking a risk if you write about that person for your dissertation or your focus of your research, because it's not in high demand. And so there's a way in which, as it were, the market dynamics of academia can unduly sideline important thinkers and important ways of thinking. And so the sort of proto-integral thinkers that were early integral thinkers that Steve is referring to, I think are some of those sideline figures, with the exception of Hegel, who is still seriously studied, but is often, but his sort of, you might say, big spiritual view of the cosmos, I think, is not really taken that seriously by most academic philosophers, because, they don't want to claim any grand spiritual cosmic narrative. They don't want to be attached to that because, that sounds a little too woo-woo and it can be hard to defend. And, the psychology of academics is another obstacle here as well, which is, being worried about being criticized for coloring outside the lines and, making claims you can't back up and so on. So those are a couple other things. One last thing I would say is about critical race theory that Steve mentioned, and how this mode of intellectual discourse has become very common. I actually think that among academic philosophers, there is an appreciation for the ways it can be used as a blunt instrument and the ways it can be used as a very critical instrument. And I think it's a lot of humanities folks, whether in history or sociology or anthropology, who this may not be fair, but I think who are a little more carried away by the political winds than the philosophers who know some more of the history of this way of thinking. That's just my sense. I could be wrong about that. So when I say postmodernism is dead, I don't so much mean a commitment to progressive values politically, but more a certain method of doing philosophy, of deconstruction and post-structuralism that was more in vogue among continental philosophy scholars in the 90s and 2000s. I think that's running a little dry, and more philosophers, as a last point, are becoming more public-facing. And realizing we got to sort of get our heads out of the sand, or, out of the ivory tower, and, use our quote unquote critical thinking skills in order to help people sort out how crazy our public discourse has become. So those are just a few things that came up. But we could go into any of those in detail if you want.
I'm just interested in hearing more about all of this.
Yeah.
Honestly.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm very interested in the evolution of academic philosophy. What's going on. We see the evolution of our culture. I'm fascinated that you say that postmodern philosophy is running out of gas in academic philosophy, and that's interesting. And so what's coming in? What's next? Is it more integral, or is there something else coming in? And I'm just curious as to the landscape.
So as I started to mention, one of the things that's really coming in has to do with the generational turnover. And that is, more millennial thinkers sort of, becoming professors and, editing journals and, starting to just basically gain more power over the conversation. And, this is a generation who grew up, for the most part, on the internet with Facebook and with the, increasingly concerning global problems from climate change to, the post-truth information ecology that we are in, to political polarization, and so on. And, a generation literally more plugged in, where you can't keep the world at arm's length. And experimenting and being conversant in forms of media, such as podcasting, such as blogging, such as, writing for popular audiences, that the boundary between so-called academic philosophy and public philosophy is starting to weaken. And actually, one thing that's changing is the leadership in the American Philosophical Association is now working to find a way to incentivize young scholars to work on more publicly engaged projects, in the form of, how do we count, running a blog that is viewed by, 50,000 people a month, as, is that equal to, placing an article in an obscure journal that's going to be read by 50 people? I should think so. So how to measure impact, and factor that into the norms that govern the profession and that, incentivize people to work on certain things. So part of it is generational turnover, that's incentivizing people to do more publicly engaged philosophy. And, most of that I've seen is not integral, explicitly. But I think it is in a sort of indirect way, in that, one of the, I think, super skills with education generally, forget about integral, is, as Plato says, once the philosopher has escaped the cave, the world of shadows and appearances, and grasp the truth, the challenge is how to return to the cave and communicate to other people using shadows in order to turn them away from the shadows, or just using skillful means, in the Buddhist phrase. And so, writing for a public audience, I've always thought, is that kind of challenge. How do you distill what you've seen, or what you think you've seen, into a language that's going to be accessible, while also not talking down to people who, might not have that expertise or that background. So it's how to balance those two things, of, height of realization, but also breadth of accessibility and communication. And so more philosophers, more academics are doing that. Mm-hmm. And I think that has a healthy kind of, I hate to use the phrase consciousness raising, but let's go ahead and do it. Consciousness raising effect on more people. Yeah. So that's part of what I see.
Yeah, no, that's great. Fascinating.
All right, well, let me follow up on that then. I personally want to see departments of philosophy and academic philosophers such as yourself preserved as a discrete category that can look ultimately as upstream in the culture as possible. Mm-hmm. But I'm seeing more and more, as these lines are being blurred, to pick up a little bit on what you said, that rather than thinking about, well, who are the most prominent voices in philosophy right now, and where might academic philosophy go right in the future, while being an interesting question unto itself, let me ask you whether you agree with this characterization, and that is one of the major philosophical tasks of our time in history, whether it's being undertaken by professional philosophers or not, I would argue is this beginning to understand that something comes after the postmodern. And when I mean postmodern, I'm not just talking about, the French post-structuralists. I'm talking about this larger worldview that's emerged beyond modernity, which rejects much of modernity and which has been, in some ways, the subject of continental philosophy for the last, 50 years or more. Mm-hmm. And you're seeing the relative ideational exhaustion of that, right? I mean, being critical can only go so far, which the task now being, at least the way we see it at the Institute for Cultural Evolution, is a very important task of revalorizing modernity. recognizing that the liberal values and the individual freedoms and the rights and all of the gifts of modernity are not something that we can take for granted or they're just handed to us like a utility. It's something that we actually have to value, intergenerationally, right?
And
but
renew.
What goes with that, what goes with revalorizing modernity is also pointing out what comes after post-modernity, right? The post-progressive, as we call it. Of course, integral is a synonym. So I'm just curious as you see other academics who may not be on our radar screen who are doing that. So I'll just say a little bit more, and that is I noticed that some of the ones who are beginning to realize that modernity is what they call the great fact. The way I put it, it's like the Cambrian explosion and cultural evolution, and so this way of talking about the great fact or the great enrichment of modernity, while realizing it's not the end of history, it has all these negative externalities. We can't just be partisans of modernity. That time has passed. But the idea that we can leave it behind and it's going to remain as this freestanding font of civilization building values without further concern, I think is folly given what we can see in history. So I'm just curious whether you agree with that or whether you see other philosophers that are engaged in that task and how you think it might either be received or rejected within the current environment of academic professional philosophy.
Yeah. It's hard to say. I mean, there's a group of thinkers I'm not terribly familiar with. I'd like to be more familiar with that go under the name object-oriented ontology. What is his name? Graham Harman, who's another Heidegger scholar who sort of made a shift into doing his own thing. Who has written about this by object-oriented, part of the idea there is, as I understand it, is a reconnection to like materiality. It might sound so, obvious, but the tendency for one of my favorite lines from I heard from a conference, this scholar, he said, philosophers' intellectual propensity toward abstraction borders on neurosis. Love that line because I think it's true. And, a lot of theories focus so much on discourse and in phenomenology, internal experience, and there can be a drift toward idealism. So the object-oriented ontologists are trying to, come back to the materiality of the world as, starting point. And in particular, thinking about technology and tool being and how that shapes our consciousness. So that's one that comes to mind. But I'm not sure beyond that. One thing that's hard is another way to answer. I think it was Jeff's question earlier. What's the lay of the land? What's emerging that's new is that there's so much. There's been so much fragmentation and so many, subfields mushrooming that as with maybe an analogy is with the shift from cable television to streaming services, where some people watch Netflix and some people watch HBO, and it's a sort of bricolage that everybody's putting together, but no one has or could have a view of the whole of what's going on. And so, as in our media environment, it can contribute to a kind of balkanization and fragmentation that makes it hard for any one person to know sort of where the discipline is going as a whole. And so the way I see it is, it's about finding coalitions of the close enough minded, not like-minded, but close enough minded that who are interested in taking a conscious and intentional role in, pooling intellectual capital, as it were, to invest in a new direction for the discipline. So, that's something I'm interested in exploring, and, just in the middle of this conversation, starting to realize that's probably part of what I really want to do. is try to find try and find such a coalition to build and to, eventually start teaching courses along these lines. And that's another thing I would love to get into is how to go about teaching integral. As you mentioned a few moments ago, Steve, it's the importance of preserving academic philosophy as its own distinct thing, very far upstream from the culture, in part because, as some people have argued, and I think as Ken argued in Trump in a Post-Truth World, one way to make sense of what's happening is the mainstreaming of postmodernism. Ideas that were, just ideas decades ago, but in a convoluted, long drawn out way, found their way into the culture and were, used, often hijacked by nefarious purposes, like somebody like Steve Bannon. So practicing what I would call Republican postmodernism. But the teaching of post-progressive or integral ideas, or whatever we want to call them, to college students and graduate students who are going to, decades down the road, be in leadership positions and shaping the culture. I think that's a really important long game to plan for and invest in and keep an eye on.
And how are you going about that, David? Are you teaching integral in any explicit way? I see you're doing a course on integral Christianity. Mm-hmm. And how are you approaching your students, and how are they responding? Yeah.
So I have been extremely reluctant to do this. I've been teaching at BC for about eight years now or so. And, I develop my own courses, and I teach what I want to teach in those new courses. But I don't know. I've just been more reticent to bring it in. But I finally decided, you know what? Like, I've taught this great books course, 8 times, and I'm just going to do it and see what happens. So the text that I'm using, this is actually the first semester that I'm doing it. I'm using Integral Christianity, as you mentioned, by Paul Smith. And I decided to use this text because it presents developmental thinking in the context of a particular tradition. And it's a tradition that most of the students are familiar with. So BC is about 70% Catholic. And it's not that, abstract and, it's not an academic tome. It's very accessible. And he provides nice sort of bite-sized little descriptions of each wave or mode of consciousness or worldview. And so I wanted to give them this at the start of the course. And I wanted to give it to them so that they would have a reference point, something to look for as they make their way through Plato and Aristotle and Genesis and Exodus and all, it's a lot. But I also told them that it's what I wish I had been presented with when I was taking this course 20 years ago, when I was your age, because I found integral philosophy outside of my academic studies. And it proved to be the most influential thing for helping me make sense of the world. It's always hard to make sense of the world, whatever age you're at. But geez, you guys don't have it easy.
Yeah.
Right on.
Well, so then the students encountering, this introductory text to a developmental perspective, especially as couched, within a spiritual context. Yeah. I'm curious as to both objections and the things that they liked, and what were some of the reactions?
Yeah. So what I did, first of all, is I divided them up into groups of 3 or 4, and I assigned a worldview to each group. And I said, choose a spokesperson who's going to, record stuff and speak for the group, and, try and identify what are the main features of this group. How did they divide the world up into saints and sinners or whatever? And can you think of examples from your own experience or from the culture of this worldview or these values. And so we went kind of, one by one. And perhaps unsurprisingly, students who had the warrior consciousness mentioned Trump. So, I asked, does that sound right to other people? And that's another important thing I would say too, is, whenever somebody will put something forth, I will say, okay, so you're saying blah, 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 mirror that back to them, a little active listening, and then ask, does anybody want to support that? Or does anybody want to disagree? And that was one. But for the progressive view, students, mentioned the Black Lives Matter movement, kind of unsurprisingly. But afterward, I asked them, do you see any problems with this model? And sure enough, one of the girls raised her hand and said, well, it seems to be saying that people who are, at a higher level are better than other people. And so I was like, well, that sounds like a really good objection. Can anybody think of a way to defend the model from that objection? And somebody who had been studying the warrior model said something interesting. They were like, well, like one thing we said was that the warrior model can really come out in sports and athletics. But we wouldn't say that, that means that, a professional athlete is necessarily at warrior consciousness. They just know how to access that. So they intuited the idea that, as Don Beck liked to say, these are types in people and not types of people. And I kind of added to that and said, yeah, and we could probably also say that, you might have, postmodern values, but you can still be a jerk. And you could have an average, center of gravity at a quote unquote higher level. But if you haven't integrated the levels below that, you could be a worse person than somebody who's amber, but who is an integrated amber person, who sort of has their shit together, so to speak. So that was something that was, as it were, a teachable moment that they connected with. But one other student also said that in response to that girl's objection was, it sounds like that's what a postmodern objection would be to integral. So they saw it. And a couple things I'll just briefly note, we can, dive into it more deeply, is one, after we did this introductory lesson, I said to them, I'm not saying this model is true, but I do think it's useful. And it may work for you to make sense of the course material we're working through, and it may not. But just keep an eye out as we make our way through the Bible, as we make our way into the modern thinkers. Do you see these worldviews and these values emerging? And do you see them beyond the material we're studying? So that was how I presented them, more as an offering and a tool. And, this is not necessarily the final word or the be all end all. And then the last point is that, and I would really love to talk more with the both of you about, is to what extent is there the potential for this generation to, as it were, develop more quickly through various stages? And how critical is it to inoculate them against what is increasingly, a prevalent sort of mean green, illiberal progressivism that is at odds with modernism and at odds with traditionalism. So those are just some preliminary thoughts on how it's gone and some of my hopes for where it can go and what value it might have beyond my own teaching.
So in terms of trying to assess the appetite for the generation coming of age now, I don't know what you call them, post-millennials, or the generation after the millennial generation, I have two sons. One is 29 and the other is 15. So the 29-year-old is a thoroughly in the millennial generation and shows it in many ways. And I can definitely tell that the post-millennial 15-year-old is not of that generation. There's significant differences. My older son, though, because he grew up with integral philosophy and knows it backwards and forwards, and he sort of lamented to me, he said, Dad, I mean, when he was a teenager, he said, you've ruined me. All my friends, they got dreadlocks and they're fully into progressivism and embracing it. And I have to stand outside of it. You've sort of ruined it for me. I can't just go along with the crowd. And we had a good laugh over that. But the most heartening thing that my post-millennial said, I mean, again, I've tried to share my point of view, and I think he generally has taken it up by assimilation, if not by direct conversation. But I overheard him talking to one of his friends who says, the far left and the far right, they just want to control you. I'm not going for either. And I thought, okay, he's somewhat inoculated. But I'm just curious as to, your current batch of students, where you see they are in that process of being born again within progressivism and adopting it as a kind of religious identity, or being skeptical of its absolutistic demands and claims.
Yeah. And I think I'm going with Generation Alpha for what we're calling the post generations. Yeah, I've heard that in a couple places. I really like it.
It's sticky.
I really like it for, just as a side note, I really like it for a variety of reasons. But it's, it's restarting. It's beginning anew, sort of in this new, perhaps second axial age that we are moving into, or already in, depending on your narrative. But at least the students I teach, they seem to intuitively grasp, for the most part, the way in which wokeism, so to speak, is stifling and virtue signaling and a new form of conformism. Not that that's the entirety of it, but I think they are tuned in pretty well to those harmful features of it. And it's one reason that I intentionally, and this is actually maybe a good transition to Jonathan Haidt's work, that I intentionally do a lot of work early in the semester to name those elephants in the room. That is, the expectations that they may be bringing to what is permissible to talk about in the classroom because of what they've absorbed from the culture. And I try to reassure them that, I am not that liberal New England professor who, will give you an F if you mention Jordan Peterson in your philosophy paper. And I try to signal very powerfully that, if we can't talk about ideas freely here in a college classroom, gosh, what does that say about, the real tolerance level in our society for ideas that we disagree with? So my students seem, I actually think there's a pretty healthy balance among my students who sort of lean green and lean, more modernist or even into traditional. It's one of the reasons it's a nice place to teach. And there's not too much militancy, as it were, for any particular worldview, which may actually be an excess too much in the other direction. I mean, BC's a little too buttoned up and proper, I think. Could use a little more, rowdiness, so to speak. But I can speak a little bit to students that I don't teach, and that's just based on what I hear from colleagues who teach at small liberal arts colleges or who teach at public universities. And there, the problem seems as much with the administrators in and some of the faculty in colleges as with the students themselves. And that is administrators who work with students on extracurricular activities and who are almost sort of grooming them to adopt or consolidate a sort of, illiberal progressive view of the world, and, have that be their hammer to, hit, see everything as a nail, to make everything, see all nails in that respect. So that does sound pretty prevalent, and that's a big problem. And one organization, at least, that I see as trying to counter that, and this comes back to Jeff's question about, what is new or what's emerging. Jonathan Haidt has helped to start an organization called Heterodox Academy. And it's based on the goal of promoting viewpoint diversity. So it says diversity is important, but what's also important is viewpoint diversity, not just diversity in the typical sense of identity markers. And the goal there is to try and, through lesson plans, through readings, through talks on campuses, to try and create a more hospitable argument, a hospitable environment, so that students can feel comfortable disagreeing and not worry that, what they say on a message board or discussion board, or what they say in class could be, recorded or repeated or sent viral and, smear their reputation or whatever. And especially at such a time where, belonging needs in Maslow's hierarchy are, what it's all about. They want to find their people in their community. So I see that as a really positive organization, trying to, as sort of antibodies that the culture has created to push back against the extent to which sort of mean green has flexed its muscles very powerfully in the last few years in academia.
Yeah, it's a good. The Heterodox Academy is a good moderating force, definitely. But how effective they can be, in the onslaught of this movement is still a question, to be observed. Yeah.
I mean, one last thing I'll say too is that another variable here, I guess we could say, from the lower right quadrant, is the economics of higher education, and how, students kind of visceral sense that, the system is somehow stacked against them, whether it's the price of tuition or student loans, combined with, other senses that our society is just not sustainable and is dysfunctional, with regard to, our politics coming apart and climate change, becoming more observable. I think it's harder as a young person to have a kind of basic natural confidence in the institutions of learning that are part of, this whole social complex. So I suspect that's fueling a lot of the mean green stuff, and why it might, at least at face value, make sense of the world that they're growing up into.
Yeah. It would be good to at least spend a little time focusing on this excellent paper, which we've just published on the Post-Progressive Post. It's an excerpt or kind of an abbreviated version, I don't know how you describe it, of a longer chapter, which you contributed to a forthcoming Routledge academic anthology on climate change communication. Perhaps you can describe it better than me, but I'd love to hear a summary of that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, as a little bit of background, part of what my academic research was on was environmental ethics in general and climate ethics in particular. And, climate ethicists have a lot of good arguments. They draw on the Kantian tradition in ethics. They draw on utilitarianism. They draw on virtue ethics, from Aristotle and so on. And, they all converge on like pretty much similar conclusions. The global North has obligations to the global South. We have obligations to future generations. The wealthy countries should be doing a lot more than they presently are. And that, extant climate agreements and climate policies are unjust in that sense. However, ethics has not really penetrated public policy all that much. And as one of my colleagues who worked at the State Department, I mentioned before, said, one thing you have to understand is that when it comes to the public policy realm, economists have a total lock on value, on the concept of value. And there's sort of a tacit hope or expectation, I think, on the part of a lot of academic ethicists that, they publish these papers and somewhere along the line, they will find their way over the wall, over the wall of the ivory tower and sort of trickle down, into public policy, into think tanks or whatnot. And it turns out that doesn't really happen, or it hasn't really appreciably happened enough over the last few decades. So my thinking was, we're learning all this interesting stuff from the social sciences. There's a huge literature on how people form their beliefs around climate change, as well as a variety of issues. And a great reference for listeners that might be interested is the Yale Project on Climate Change Communication, where they actually break down, they call it Global Warming 6 Americas. And they have 6 different profiles of populations of what people believe about climate, whether it's not happening or whether it's the end of the world, the full range, the full spectrum. And so my thinking was, how can we draw on this literature, this social scientific literature, to message climate ethics and policies in such a way that will connect with as broad a diversity of worldviews and value systems as possible. And I'd been working on this for a long time. I had written another related paper about it. But then I read your book, Steve, on developmental politics, and I found it a very useful way to reframe some of the social scientific literature. And one of the lines in your book that I really like, I can't quote it off the top of my head, but was something like, one of the philosophical problems with social science is it purports to be value neutral. But in practice, it can often be prescriptive because people will read this and say, oh, well, social scientists are, finding this, so it must be true. So, we should use this in a kind of naive fashion. So using a philosophical framework to contextualize the social science and drill down into the cultural values that are at play in disagreements over climate is very useful. But what none of the social science that I'm familiar with has is the developmental component. And Haidt's research in particular is extremely valuable. I think it wouldn't be striking such a nerve in the culture as it is, and becoming so widely adopted, if it weren't tracking something true about people's moral psychology. However, and Haidt was a former progressive, and he has this story of the progressive scales dropping from his eyes and how closed-minded in his bubble, how green he was in effect, and starting to appreciate the value of conservative thinking. However, I think he makes a mistaken inference, which is that because progressives are so intolerant, we need to sort of tack back to the center and become centrists. And while that's good in that it's checking, a kind of absolutistic form of progressivism, it only leaves us with the idea that, well, people just believe differently. And we can't rank one worldview or moral psychology as better or more truth apt or truth tracking than another. And the whole idea of tolerating a diversity of viewpoints is itself a very progressive idea, and feeling into the lived experience of someone else's point of view is very much, a kind of progressive, mode of thinking and feeling. So that was sort of a gap that I saw in how social science in general and Haidt's model in particular have been applied to climate. So I could say more, but that's kind of the upshot of how can this developmental mode of thinking help us message climate and better understand the real roots of disagreement and where we might find harmonies among groups that are at odds over the issue.
Right. So much of the philosophy of modernity, at least is sort of been colonized by social science, which has this stealth relationship to its normative influence, and how even the progressives, they still have a hierarchical model. It's just a two-stage model, right? Everybody else down there and us up here with a more ethical view. So the thing about a developmental perspective and why Haidt resists it or ignores it or tries to sidestep it is because it's normative dimensions. It's should, the idea that some things are more developed than others and that development is good. Maturity is to be valued, although not in a simplistic, linear, hierarchical way. But this idea that we can understand the universe without making any observations about the movement of value in the world is absurd. So when we bring in this developmental, the most challenging thing about it is that it's inescapably normative, and that freaks people out who are clinging to these delusions of ethical objectivity, which don't exist because everything's moving. Yeah. So I'm glad you're picking on Haidt. We admire him. We see him as an ally, Heterodox Academy, and his defending modernity in his own way. So we like him, but we think ultimately that he's clinging to a modernity that's been superseded by the evolution of human thought. So I'm glad you're writing about that.
Yeah. I mean, a couple of things. One thing is that I think that the Haidt's perspective wants to maximize civility, and it's such a tricky word because of course we want people to listen to each other more and not be reactive and so on. That's all great. I think the challenge is that, at least the way it's framed, it often seems to be that, well, these people just believe this and those people just believe that, almost as if we're hardwired differently. And Haidt's model draws quite a bit on evolutionary. So it's an evolutionarily based model with the idea that we sort of evolved these different moral taste buds, as the analogy he uses.
Right, a reductionistic evolutionary view, right, as opposed to a more growth-oriented one, like we try to represent.
Well, anyway, one thing that I think your perspective provides that is good is it challenges tribalism. There's probably no concept that's become more prevalent, I think, in the way that we think about politics nowadays than tribalism. That's identified as the problem, but also as the reality, as if you're just in your tribe and that's just the way you are, and I'm just in my tribe and that's just the way it is. And the best we can hope for is civility, that we don't, we don't fight in the real world, obviously, but that we fight less also in the virtual world. And, those are good goals, but not sufficient, I think. One of the strengths of your book is that you show that these worldviews are actually now interdependent on one another. And that's a new phenomenon. So how to rethink them so that they're not necessarily at odds and in a kind of zero-sum game, but that their values are actually important. And this is crucial, I think, for a couple of reasons. One is that for, I think, a lot of the history of the environmental movement, the story has been very black and white, zero sum. It's economic growth versus environmental sustainability. It's, orange versus green, modernism versus postmodernism, so to speak. But I think what we're finding is that we need not just both of those, but all three, in the sense of those two and traditionalism. The notion of, for instance, the values of tradition and loyalty and sanctity, the idea of, a national project to, deal with climate and be a leader in the world, that's an inspiring national story that could bind us together as a people. And, the notion of, sacrificing for your country, those are really powerful and deeply rooted values, and older and more primal values than modern and postmodern ones. And so, those are powerful assets to draw on as part of an overall approach to dealing with a problem like climate. Yes, we need, new energy systems. Yes, we need engineers who think differently. Yes, we need different economic incentives and policies. Yes, we need activists. But, there's also an important place for, I think, traditionalism in the overall way we think and talk and vote around climate, and in a way that's not manipulative and condescending. Another thing you mentioned in your book that I like is that some framing approaches, some persuasion strategies, like George Lakoff's framing approach, there's kind of an understanding there that like we have the right values, that is progressives, and social conservatives have the wrong values. But if we're really clever and use the right words, then like they won't hate us as much, and maybe they'll vote. Some of them will vote for progressive stuff, and people can smell that. They can smell when they're being played. This is sort of maybe taking us a little off track, but I know that, Jeff, you have cited Pete Buttigieg as a potential integral thinker. I think Steve disagrees. I think we disagreed about that the last time we talked. But I'm like you, Jeff. My heroes are Ken Wilber and Barack Obama, and I've never had a reaction to a politician like Obama until Pete Buttigieg.
Yeah.
I think he has a way of speaking to traditionalists in a way that's genuine, in a way that opens them up, and in a way that can potentially grow them, at least some of them.
He gets it. He feels it too.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's not coming from a place of manipulation.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I agree. And I see more and more people that, just have that fragrance of integral, where they just have to use the classic expression, they have a flex flow mind. They can take multiple perspectives. They have a big capacity for not just seeing, but feeling into the different worldviews that people have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think too that to come back to some of the ideas from the paper, I think somewhat in the same way that the erosion of traditional communities in rural America was driven in part by globalization that pushed them to someone like Trump. I think that as the effects of climate become more visible and more local, the issue will become more personal. They'll start thinking about, the land my family and my ancestors have lived on for generations is now under threat. My children and their children may not be able to live here. That's something that I think is going to start shifting folks with that perspective to treat climate more seriously. And it's just another reason why the way we talk and message climate from an ethical perspective, from a policy perspective, I think needs to incorporate that reality and take the foot off the gas of, the usual, screw the fossil fuel companies and like the usual kind of, rhetoric that often comes out of the environmental community.
Right.
Yeah.
So, Steve, anything else you want to hit?
Well, I know that David wanted to ask us a question or two, and so let's give him a chance to do that.
Yeah, great. So, wow, this is a thrill. I mean, just as a side note, this is a thrill. I've been listening to the Daily Evolver for years. Never imagined I would be a guest and get to ask questions on the air. But
wonderful.
I'm really interested to hear what both of you think about where the integral or post-progressive movement is going. So I guess two related questions. How do you see it having evolved over the last decade or so? And where do you see it going? My sense is that the pump is primed for a sort of integral renaissance or integral 2.0 or 3.0 or wherever we are. And I just sense from a variety of different directions, a number of thinkers who are, doing their own thing, who have some connection to the integral community or some history with it. So it seems like a kind of, let 1,000 flowers bloom type of a period with different iterations of integral. So that's just some of my rough sense. But I'm curious to hear your view of it, given that you're both more plugged into it than I am.
Yeah, well, I could just sort of chart out how I've seen it evolve since I've been a part of it since 2003. So going on 20 years here now. And at that point, 2003, 2007 was when I was working with the Integral Institute. And this is when Ken Wilber was really coming out of his, writing mode and going more public. And we did these series of seminars. We did, 30 or 40 different seminars where people would come from all over the world and spend a week. Ken would come twice. We would do integral psychology, integral business, integral spirituality, integral life practice. And those brought a lot of people together. So what we were trying to do with the Integral Institute was to sort of civilize the integral movement and give it shape and a coherence. And I don't think it wanted that. Actually, at the time, I think people, and I see it, it's a little bit like you were saying, David, about going from the three networks to, HBO and all of these various, there's just a proliferation of ideas. And I know a lot of people who are dedicated integralists, and they believe all kinds of things. Some of them won't get vaccinated. Some of them have alien friends. Some of them think the world's going to end in 10 years, max. I mean, they have all sorts of points of view. And I don't think there was any civilizing of that was going to be possible. So that's sort of the self-identified integral folks, is that everybody is out doing their podcast, having each other on their podcast, reading each other's stuff, criticizing it. There's a lot of fruitful fighting as well as friending going on in the integral world. So that's the sort of self-identified people who know about integral. The other thing I would say is that integral consciousness is arising under its own power in the world at large among people who have no idea about Steve McIntosh or Ken Wilber or the Institute for Cultural Evolution or anything. And that's just this, I often say boredom is the great engine of evolution. They're just bored with these, totalitarian worldviews that they've been given, and all of the defenses they have against, modernism or traditionalism. And I see that really a lot among young people. I do think that our grandchildren will roll their eyes at a lot of the culture war that we're fighting right now, because it's kind of obvious that everybody has a piece of the truth. I mean, it's becoming more and more obvious. And, with Trump and with this sort of consolidation and self-identification among traditionalists and MAGA, I think the culture has been served notice. I have. I mean, I thought we were going to be able to go on without them, if they were going to be left to the ash heap of history, but not so fast. And I'm happy about that, because what they're saying is you can't go forward until you incorporate our values, or at least what's important about our values. And again, welcome to the culture war, which I'm a lot friendlier to than a lot of people, even in the integral world. I think there's a differentiation that is happening in the culture that is prior to the integration that will happen. And that we have a long ways to go in the culture war. I don't know how long, but we have a ways to go because we still don't understand each other. But the idea that arguing and fighting with each other makes us understand each other less is false. Kicking and screaming, we do open our minds. They get forced open through the fight itself. And so as long as we're not using clubs and guns, I'm pretty friendly to it. And, like you said, let many flowers blossom.
I think it's a great point. Like culture wars are a good problem to have.
Yeah, exactly.
In the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, especially when we're just sort of assassinating each other on Twitter.
So let me take a crack at your question about sort of where we are in history. I think that if our theoretical construct of worldviews, right, being these intergenerational, large-scale value agreement that have a kind of a systemic reality in the intersubjective realm, right? In the we space, there's a real system there, and it's not just a whole bunch of people's thoughts, or it's not just a bunch of artifacts. It has this kind of freestanding, and it exhibits this evolutionary, it recapitulates or expresses the structure of emergence that we see in biological and cosmological evolution. So there's this kind of Russian doll effect where this next stage is building upon the platform of success provided by, the fruition of the previous level of development. So if that's true, if these worldviews are real entities and indeed the basic units of culture, then a big factor in the larger historical scheme of things is the looming into view of the progressive postmodern worldview as a worldview, right? Up until very recently, it was compartmentalized, right? People didn't connect the dots. There was progressive spirituality, which, New Age spirituality, which was once a major cultural force, an economic force in the 90s and the aughts, but has since basically faded away as a cult, sort of dead in the water culturally at this point. At least if you look at conferences and, other kinds of media and the books being published, and the quality of discourse has gone way down, much more commercial, much more magical. Then there was the far left, right, or the environmental movement. And even though there was some kind of vague sense that there was an affinity between these different aspects of the progressive postmodern worldview, with the ideology of anti-racism kind of coming to the fore and gaining much more political and social success than any of these other components, ideological components of progressivism, that has, it's talk about an elephant in the room, and the elephant is just, busted down the door and captured many of America's institutions for good and bad, right? Progressivism is not all bad, but especially since 2020, the fact that progressivism is here, that it has major power, that it's got the potential to gain a lot more political power, that its cultural power seems unstoppable, that the clerisy, the sort of the intellectual and cultural elite have been largely co-opted or recruited by it. This is a hinge of history we're living in right in this year, right in 2021. Green looms large, right? And we see it as a threat for the first time, not just some cute little leftism we can put in a corner.
Yeah.
That is the big event which this philosophy has been waiting to take the stage for, right? In other words, when I first was attracted to this was in the 90s when Paul Ray in 1995 published his sociology about the cultural creatives. And we thought, that's us. That names our culture in a way that hasn't been named before. And just the naming of it brought it into existence, to a degree. But now it is evident to the mainstream, and indeed many of the influential people in the United States are fully aligned with it. And so that creates a powerfully problematic life condition that can help stimulate the emergence of this next great phase of human history, which we hope and claim that this integral or post-progressive worldview will be. And so just last week, I presented these ideas to a group of business people at the Young Presidents Organization, right, in Denver. It was a pretty big audience. They were pretty well engaged. And they were looking for answers, right? Some were clinging to traditionalism. Some were kind of offended progressives. But the majority were pragmatists. And they realized they weren't so much politically ideological as they were caring about stability of American society and a basic social solidarity that could underpin a functional democracy. And so they were alive to these negative life conditions in a way that I haven't seen previous mainstream audience be in the years ahead. So I think that this is our golden moment in the sense that we have a solution to a wicked problem, which does threaten America's democracy and culture. So focusing where we're focusing on now, we hope that this post-progressive framing and the momentum that we have with the Institute for Cultural Evolution can be, a reasonable part of the birthing of this next worldview. Obviously, there's more to it than our line that's leading into it, but we do hope that this project of revalorizing modernity and showing what comes after post-modernity, that's a winning combination that will hopefully gain traction in the years ahead. And so we're poised to really take advantage of those situations.
Yeah. Sounds like a number of those audience members may have been part of the exhausted majority from the named from the Hidden Tribes report. So I think that's an interesting cohort to engage. People who are aware of all these problems, but don't have an inspiring and motivating and coherent worldview to help them make sense. And so they have a better answer than just, there's extremes in the right and left, and I'm just going to, I don't like politics, I'm going to stay away from this. So they have something positive that they can connect with. Yeah, that sounds really promising. Yeah.
Right on.
So David, tell us where we can view your or listen to your podcast, Wisdom at Work.
Yeah, so it's on Apple Podcasts. You can find it on Spotify. You can also go to my website. It's www.davidstory.com. So my podcast is hosted there, my blog. So anything you can find there.
Great.
Yeah. And I also should say, I'm always on the lookout for new folks to interview. I interview people who don't necessarily have a background in academic philosophy, but whose work has, some ethical or philosophical component, and some pretty broad about who I like to interview. So if anyone's interested in being a guest or recommending a guest, please let me know.
Great.
Will do. Yeah. And I would also point people to your article in the Post-Progressive Post, Why We Will Grow Together or Grow Apart, Cultural Intelligence and Climate Change. And it's terrific, and I encourage everybody to check it out. And thank you, Steve McIntosh. Thank you, David Storey, for joining me for another edition of Post-Progressive Inquiries. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for having me.